Hi guys and welcome to another Fool of the Week. This week's Fool is our old friend Rupert Lowe, an ex-Reform UK MP turned independent. Now, Rupert is asking a question here during PMQs about something that I ironically disagree with, the death penalty, capital punishment. Now, he puts forward his reasoning for it, and I'll explain why I think it's a big pile of crap. Have a listen.
We hear of a brutal murder, rape or stabbing, far too often perpetrated by someone who should not be in our country to begin with. Does the Prime Minister agree that for cases where the guilt is so undeniable, the crime so monstrous, the evil so irredeemable, the reintroduction of the death penalty for both foreign and domestic criminals should be put to the British people in a legally binding referendum?
Okay, before we get to this point, why is he so much like Nigel Farage? Whenever he's in the House of Commons, he never asks questions about his constituents. He asks questions about things that are completely unrelated to his constituents. You could probably count on one hand the amount of times he's raised something about his constituency. Anyway, so the main point here of the death penalty. Look, there are a few things to say about this. First of all, the UK would have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights to impose the death penalty once again. Now, Rupert Lowe, of course, is an advocate for leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. He doesn't care about protections for human rights. And if the UK did leave, then of course it would remove the right to freedom of expression. It would remove the right or the protection for the right to a free trial, due process. So he's advocating for people's due process to be taken away, or at least the protection for it, and at the same time for the execution of people who would be found guilty in a court where maybe people's due process was not enforced. So he wants people executed even if there isn't a robust conviction there. Now, this is insane. How can you be advocating for something and say, well, once we know that people are truly guilty, then it's okay to execute them? When we know in the past, in the United States, for example, there have been numerous cases where somebody was sent to the electric chair or the gas chamber or was given the lethal injection, and it was later discovered that that individual was innocent or not guilty. That DNA evidence had been presented a number of years later and vindicated that individual. How would Rupert Lowe respond to cases like that, where it was miscarriage of justice? Now, there are other issues. It's presented as a deterrent, but as with the United States, it doesn't work as a deterrent. There are a number of states in the US that have the death penalty, and it does not deter people from committing the types of crimes that Rupert Lowe is talking about. So it's not a deterrent. If it was a deterrent, there would be no crimes. But it's not, obviously. There are other issues. In the United States in particular, and this is pretty gruesome, there were a number of cases where the pharmaceuticals necessary for the lethal injections were banned for export by companies in Europe because there were petitions against them supplying the United States with these chemicals. And prisons in the US decided to make up the chemicals themselves and carry out the executions using their own chemicals, which were not fit for the purpose, and it resulted in botched executions where people were not properly executed, in the sense that they were not executed. They were or the execution was drawn out over many hours when it's meant to last a couple of minutes. It became torture in a sense, something that the executioner is not supposed to engage in. It was an absolute disaster, and it's still going on, unfortunately. So if the UK left the European Convention on Human Rights and the chemicals necessary to carry out lethal injections, for example, were not produced in the UK and they had to be imported, well, there could be an export ban from countries like Germany, France, Belgium, or whatever. So how would these executions be carried out? There are so many questions here. But this is not about justice. This is about punishment. And I want to say one final thing on this. I think life imprisonment is a much better punishment than an execution, because you take away something really important to people, their freedom. I've never been in a situation where I've lost a loved one as a result of a murder or homicide, but I think it makes more sense for someone to have to spend the rest of their life in a prison cell, even if they have PlayStations, if they have gyms, everything, but your freedom is taken away from you. You can no longer walk out your door and go down to the shops. You can no longer walk out your door and walk in the park. You can't enjoy a coffee or a beer with friends. This is something that you take away from people when they commit these types of crimes. I think this is much more of a punishment than an execution. Facing the rest of your life knowing that you can never walk in the park, you can never have a beer with friends, you can't go and have a game of football with your mates, you can't go shopping, you can't have a nice evening out with your partner. I think this is a much greater punishment than an execution. But we have to be very careful of people like Rupert Lowe and others like him who want the UK to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, to reinstate things like the death penalty. It'll be sold as, now we're going to really create a deterrent. Now we're going to punish those individuals, because if they go into prison, they're not going to be punished. We need to punish them. This is about bringing the ECHR exit in through the back door. He understands maybe that, well, if we campaign to leave, people are going to get upset that we're stripping away the protections to their rights. So we have to sell it in another way. And of course, it's very attractive to sell people this idea of punishment, true biblical type punishment, where your life is taken away from you by the state. I hope that he doesn't succeed. He was ridiculed here. He was laughed at. But there is a growing movement, unfortunately, for the reinstatement of the death penalty. It's not a deterrent. It doesn't stop people from committing these crimes. It does not provide justice or closure for families. It's just a barbaric way of getting some sort of revenge on individuals. And we've seen, as I mentioned before, examples of how it has turned out to be untrue that that individual had committed the crime.